10 years. It had been 10 years since I last set foot in that city. I left carrying every promise I had made to the woman I loved more than life itself. 10 years ago, I abandoned Elena without a single word of explanation, broken by the cruel lies that destroyed everything we had built together. Today I am a billionaire, and I am arriving here in a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom, not to ask for forgiveness, not to reconcile. I came back for one reason only, something no amount of money in the world could ever buy. Our stories are spreading all over the world. So tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Write it in the comments below. I read every single one. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and when she walked into a room, the room changed. It wasn't just her beauty, which was real and undeniable. Long dark hair falling down her back like water. Green eyes that seemed to hold a secret you could spend years trying to uncover and never quite reach. It was the way she moved through the world, with the effortless ease of someone who never had to try to be noticed, as if the space around her naturally rearranged itself to accommodate her. I saw her for the first time on a Thursday in October, in a noisy hallway at the School of Engineering, and I stopped dead in the middle of the crowd like a complete idiot, staring at her until she turned the corner and disappeared. The guy next to me nudged me with his elbow and said I was blocking traffic. I didn't even hear him. I was Alexander Nunes, son of an auto mechanic from a small town in rural Georgia, and a public school teacher who worked double shifts to keep me in New York City. My mother woke up at 5 in the morning, drank her coffee standing at the kitchen counter, caught 2 buses and came home at 8 at night with that exhaustion in her shoulders that you recognize but never mention, because mentioning it hurts too much. She never complained, never said it was hard. She just worked, and I learned from her that work isn't a punishment. It's the only currency no one can ever take from you. In New York, I shared a studio apartment with 2 other classmates, worked the overnight counter at a diner, and dropped off resumes at a tech company that hadn't called me yet, but that I knew, with a certainty I couldn't justify, would call me someday. I slept 4 hours a night and woke up with that energy that only exists when you're 22 years old and still believe the world is out there waiting specifically for you. No car, no money to spare, ambition the size of a skyscraper, and the irrational conviction of someone who hasn't yet learned that not every certainty becomes reality. Elena found me 3 weeks after that hallway. She walked into the diner where I worked one Thursday afternoon, alone, with a photography book under her arm and her hair still damp from the rain. She ordered a coffee with milk, no sugar, and sat reading for about 40 minutes without looking at her phone once, rare enough that I kept noticing. When she left, she tipped double the bill and said before walking out that I had the eyes of someone who was going far. I laughed, thinking she was just the kind of person who made a habit of being kind to strangers. She came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. On her 4th visit, she sat on the stool closest to the register and asked what the book was in my backpack under the counter. I said it was about the fundamentals of object-oriented programming, and she said it sounded fascinating, with a seriousness that made me laugh for real. She laughed too, and when we laughed together for the first time, I understood I was in trouble. 2 weeks later, we were sitting on a bench near campus at 11 at night, her head on my shoulder, me talking about my plans, the startup I wanted to build, the future I could see so clearly it sometimes hurt to look at it. She listened with an attention I wasn't used to receiving. She didn't interrupt, didn't look at her phone, she just sat there, quiet, and sometimes asked a question that proved she'd heard every word. She said she loved my ambition, said she loved me. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a rented hall in Newark, New Jersey, her family arriving in imported cars that fit better in the parking lot than in the context of the party, my mother's family arriving by bus from Georgia. Elena's mother wore a designer dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. Her father was a man of few gestures, who shook my hand with the firmness of someone making a contract and smiled with his lips without letting the smile reach his eyes. I wasn't what he had imagined for his daughter. I knew that. He knew I knew, and we both pretended we didn't. Elena didn't seem to mind. At least that's what I believed for a long time. The first years were hard in the good way, the kind of difficulty you face together that bonds people in ways the easy times never do. I was working 80 hours a week on the startup, a logistics management software that my 2 partners and I built in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn on 3 old computers, a lot of coffee, and the collective belief that what we were doing was going to work. It had to work. Elena was chasing her dream of becoming a fashion influencer, and I rooted for her with the same seriousness I rooted for myself. When she showed me new photos, I stopped everything and looked with genuine attention. When she felt down about a follower count that grew too slowly for her, I stayed up talking until she fell asleep. We fought. I won't pretend we didn't. We fought about money, about time, about her feeling that I was always more present at the office than at home. I tried to explain that the office was for both of us, that every hour there was an hour invested in the future I had promised. She listened and agreed, and then, a few days later, came back with the same complaint, that I was distant, that she felt alone, that her dream mattered too. And I agreed, and I tried, and I fell short a little, and I tried again. I believed in us, genuinely, without reservation, without second thoughts, the naive and complete way you can only believe in something before you've been taught to doubt. In the 5th year of marriage, the startup took off. A contract with a retail chain operating in 22 states came through after 8 months of negotiation, and the following week, an American investment fund signed a deal that turned the company from a promise into something concrete and measurable. I remember sitting in front of my computer, staring at the number on the spreadsheet for about 15 minutes, unable to process it. My partner Philip walked into the room, saw my face, and asked if everything was okay. I turned the screen toward him and pointed at the number. He stared. Then we both sat in silence for a stretch of time I couldn't tell you how long. I left the office before 6 for the first time in months. I bought the most expensive champagne I could find at a wine shop on the way home, called my mother from the car with a trembling voice, and told her my moment had finally come. She went quiet for a second, then said, in that calm voice she used when she was trying not to cry, that she had always known it would. I hung up and sat through a red light, unable to swallow properly. I got home with the champagne and a head full of plans rearranging themselves as I climbed the stairs. The house we were going to buy. The children we had put off because the timing never seemed right. The trip to Europe that had been sitting on a mental list for 3 years, waiting for a window that never opened. The real, concrete beginning of everything I had promised we would someday have. She wasn't home. Her phone was off. I sent a message, called 4 times, sat on the couch with the champagne still in the grocery bag, waiting. The apartment had that specific silence of a place where someone lives, but that suddenly feels like no one does. I looked at the kitchen, the bedroom, her pair of shoes in the hallway. I went to the window. I stood looking down at the street below, as if she might appear at any moment rounding the corner. At 2 in the morning, the door opened. She came in with the calm of someone returning from a place where they had been comfortable, hair slightly disheveled, wearing a heavy, sweet perfume I had never smelled on her before, the kind of expensive scent that clings to clothes and to memory. She looked at me from the doorway for a second, not with guilt, not with surprise, just with that specific exhaustion of someone who is about to do something difficult and has already decided to do it. She walked in, set her bag on the console, stood in the middle of the living room and said, in that low, controlled voice that hurt more than any yell ever could, that she was sorry, that she deserved more than waiting, that she had met someone who could give her the life she wanted now, not 10 years from now, not some future promise, but now, in this moment. And then she walked to the bedroom as if she had communicated a schedule change. I stood in the middle of the living room with the champagne still in the grocery bag. His name was Marcus Andrade, 52 years old, a venture capital investor with an office on Wall Street, the kind of man who appeared in society columns every week at events that exist mainly to be photographed. Silver hair he wore like an accessory. An apartment on the Upper East Side that I later found out was 4,000 square feet, with a terrace worth more than my car. He had met Elena at a fashion event she covered for her profile and had promised her the world on a silver platter with the fluency of someone who had promised worlds before and knew exactly which angle worked best. Elena accepted the platter with both hands before checking whether the gold was real. The divorce lasted 4 months, and she called it a clean separation with that expression of someone being reasonable and generous at the same time. I learned during that process that clean is an adjective that changes completely depending on which side you're standing on. She took half of everything we had built together in 5 years of marriage, the savings I had set aside cent by cent, while she complained I was too careful with money. The apartment we had toured together, and that I had promised would be our next home, and the company shares I had put in her name as a second anniversary gift, a naive gesture from someone who still confused love with total merger, who still believed what's mine is yours meant the same thing to both sides. She sold everything the day the judge signed the papers, didn't wait a week, didn't wait a day, made the brokerage transfer while the paperwork was still in her hands. I stared at the account balance for a long time that afternoon. Then I closed the laptop, called my mother, said I was fine without convincing either of us, and went to bed early for the first time in months. The next day, I bought a one-way ticket to Singapore. I didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't send texts at midnight, didn't call asking for an explanation. I disappeared in the quiet and deliberate way of someone who understands that some things can't be fixed, and that insisting on them wastes the only resource that can't be recovered: time. Singapore received me with the organized chaos of great Asian cities, that improbable combination of clinical efficiency and chaotic humanity that you don't understand right away, but that after a while starts making more sense than any place you've known before. The smell of street food mixed with industrial air conditioning, the subway that arrives at the exact second it was scheduled, the constant sense that everyone around you is working towards something, and that standing still is a choice. The city doesn't judge but also doesn't accommodate. I fit in perfectly. I got a job at a mid-sized tech company that developed management software for port operations. I learned basic Mandarin on weekends. I worked with the concentrated focus of someone who has nothing left to waste on distraction. Every meeting that didn't close was a lesson. Every rejection gave me more fuel. Every sleepless night in a small apartment in Toa Payoh, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed below, was one more unit of motivation deposited into an account that was growing enormous. I told myself one thing every morning, standing in front of the small bathroom mirror in that apartment before heading out. One sentence short, which I repeated with the flat conviction of someone who prays without needing emotion to believe what they're saying. She'll see what she threw away, and she'll regret it. In my third year in Singapore, I quit. I pooled what I had saved, convinced two former colleagues who had also left the company to join me, and rented a small office in a commercial building in Bugis. The company was called Nunes Tech. No creativity in the name. All the creativity went into the product. Logistics software with artificial intelligence applied to demand forecasting and automated routing. The concept wasn't new, but the execution was different from anything on the market. More precise, more adaptable, with an interface that didn't require weeks of training to make sense. The first client signed after 5 months of negotiation. The second came referred by the first. The third came by chance in a conversation at a tech conference I was attending more for networking than out of any real expectation. In the second year, we entered 2 Southeast Asian markets. In the third, we opened an office in Dubai. In the 5th, in Amsterdam. In the 8th year of operation, in a meeting with an investment bank that had approached us about a potential IPO, the company was valued at $2.3 billion. I was on Forbes' lists of entrepreneurs under 40. Private jets I used not out of ostentation, but efficiency, because time had become my scarcest asset. Charity galas where I appeared in a tailored suit, smiled for the photographer at the entrance, and then stood in a corner with a glass of sparkling water, talking to whoever seemed to have something real to say. The kind of life Elena always described when she talked about the future she wanted, built brick by brick with the hands she had let go of on a midnight in New York City, reeking of another man's cologne. But I never forgot her face that night, the coldness in her voice, the sound of the bedroom door closing after she said what she had to say, as if the conversation were a form she had filled out, submitted, and filed away. I carried that somewhere inside me with the quiet care of someone holding on to something that hurts but isn't ready to be discarded. It wasn't active resentment. It was more like a permanent awareness, a reference point that surfaced from time to time on the quietest nights, in the moments when the work stopped for an instant and the silence came in. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was on a flight from Amsterdam back to Singapore, at 36,000 feet with a report open on my laptop and coffee going cold on the tray. It was from Elena's sister Camilla, a woman I had respected during the marriage for being discreet and honest in a family environment that didn't encourage either. She had never taken sides during the divorce, never called afterward. The fact that she was writing now meant the situation was serious enough to overcome 10 years of silence. The message was short. Elena was in serious trouble. Marcus had left. She was going to lose the house in 30 days. And for old time's sake, Camilla was asking me to help. For old time's sake. I stared at the screen for 40 minutes while clouds drifted past the oval window of the plane. The report was still open, the numbers on screen waiting for attention I couldn't give back to them. I thought about deleting the message. Part of me, the most rational and coldest part that years of negotiation had developed, calculated that there was nothing in this that was my responsibility. She had made choices. Every choice has weight. She was carrying hers. But there was another part, older and darker. That smiled in a way that unsettled me a little when I recognized what it was. I called the flight attendant, asked for more coffee, opened my laptop to a new window, and bought a ticket back to the United States. The road leading to the gated community where Elena lived was lined with tall trees that cast generous shade even in the middle of the afternoon. I had driven that road a few times during our marriage, when we visited her parents who lived in a nearby neighborhood, and I remembered that back then I looked at the mansions behind the walls with that specific mixture of admiration and determination of someone still on the outside of something they dream of one day being inside, It's funny how the admiration for something changes completely when you have far more money than you would ever need to buy what was once a dream. Now I was passing those same walls in a car that cost more than most of those houses, and I felt nothing particularly special about it. Money had cured the admiration. It hadn't cured other things. The community gatehouse security guard checked my ID with that professional attention of someone trained to show no recognition, even when they do recognize. He called Elena's house, waited, hung up, and opened the gate with a discreet nod. I drove in slowly, following the internal signs to the lot numbers, passing manicured gardens with that excess of symmetry that signals a landscaper being paid to compensate for something. The mansion was exactly as it had appeared in the photos she had posted for years on social media, each space framed with the studied precision of someone who uses their own life as a display window. A stone facade, an entrance flanked by tall palms, a four-car garage now empty except for a white Honda Civic with a few years on it that contrasted with the space like a sentence out of place in a very well-written text. The infinity pool appeared on the right, long and blue, reflecting the afternoon sky with that indifferent beauty of beautiful things that exist regardless of who is watching. I parked at the entrance. The driver opened the door before I even put my hand on the handle, a habit I had tried to discourage 3 times and that he had politely ignored each time. I stepped out with my briefcase, straightened my suit, looked at the facade for a moment. Somewhere in that house was a woman who had looked me in the eyes and said she loved me, who had placed her hand in mine during the ceremony and repeated the words with a conviction I had not questioned, because there had been no visible reason to, who had slept beside me for 5 years and woken up one morning and decided she preferred somewhere else. I rang the doorbell. She took longer than I expected. I heard footsteps that stopped, started again, stopped, like someone preparing to open a door not knowing quite what's on the other side. Then the click of the lock and the door swung open. Elena Vasquez was 41 now. The hair she had worn long to her waist during our marriage was cut to her jaw, more practical, less calculated. The green eyes were still green. Time hadn't changed that, but there was an opacity in them I didn't remember, as if some layer of light had been removed from the inside out. She wore no makeup, dark blue jeans and a simple white blouse, feet bare on the cold marble of the entryway. None of the accessories that had been practically extensions of her body in the photos from the Marcus years. None of the curated glow of someone who spends hours constructing a version of themselves before appearing to be seen. She was, for the first time since I had known her, simply a person. When she saw me, the expression that crossed her face moved too quickly to have a precise name. Not surprised because she knew I was coming, not exactly relief, because relief has lightness, and what she wore had weight. Something more complex and less photogenic, the kind of expression that appears when something you've been putting off facing finally arrives at your door in a suit and doesn't smile. Alex. Her voice faltered in the middle, just one note off, but I heard it. You came. I didn't smile. You asked for help. I'm here. She opened the door wider for me to enter. I walked in. Inside, the house had that specific quality of a place that was once very full and is now becoming empty in an unplanned way. It wasn't abandonment, it was hollowing out, which is different and in some ways more melancholy. Marks on the wall where large paintings had been hung and removed, the plaster slightly lighter around the outline, like the shadow of what had been there. A dark wood bookcase missing half the books it had clearly once held. A long dining table made for at least 8 people, with one corner slightly different from the rest of the surface, the sign that someone had removed an extension leaf and hadn't quite disguised the seam. Cardboard boxes here and there, some open, some sealed with packing tape and marked with marker. The kind of boxes you see in someone's home and immediately understand that person is in the middle of a move they didn't choose to make. Elena led me through the entry and into the main living room, a generous space with high ceilings and those wide windows looking out over the pool and the garden. We sat, she in the beige armchair facing the window, me on the leather sofa that was slightly displaced from where it had clearly stood for a long time, another sign of something that had been removed from the space beside it. She folded her hands in her lap in that gesture of someone trying to appear composed and not entirely succeeding. She looked at them for a moment, as if organizing the words in her head before releasing them. Then she raised her eyes to me and began to speak. Marcus had left 6 months before. She told me this in the flat voice of someone who has replayed the story enough times that the tears had receded from the surface, but who still feels the weight under the words. He had said their lifestyle had become too expensive to sustain, given the results his businesses had been producing over the past 2 years. That the investments had gone badly, worse than badly, that there were debts he hadn't mentioned, that the structure he had built and displayed with such care on social media and at events had depended on leverage and on bets that hadn't paid off. He had left taking the cars, the offshore accounts, most of the assets he had kept in his own name over the years together, leaving behind the white Honda Civic in the garage, a few boxes of designer clothes going out of style, and the mortgage on a mansion Elena had no way of continuing to pay alone. The bank had given her 30 days. 30 days counted from a letter she had received on a Monday morning, and that had sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before she could bring herself to open it. She said all of this in a low, controlled voice, the voice of someone being honest at a high cost, without trying to wrap the situation in context or softening framing. Then she went quiet for a moment, looking at me with the expression of someone who has just set something very heavy on the table and is waiting to see what the other person does with it. Then her eyes filled. She said she knew she had hurt me, that she had been young when she did what she did, young and foolish, believing money was everything, and that the man who arrived with the money fastest was the right man. She said she had never completely stopped thinking about me, about the 5 years we had had, the conversations on the park bench at 11 at night, the way I listened when she talked. She said if she could go back. I raised my hand slowly, not sharply, just firmly. "Stop." She stopped. "I didn't come here for that, Elena. Not today. I came because you need to understand something before any other conversation." I opened the briefcase I had set beside the sofa and removed the folder. It was a plain folder, dark blue cardboard, nothing written on the cover. I placed it on the coffee table between us with care, the way you place something that carries symbolic weight beyond its physical weight, which was true. She looked at the folder, then at me, then at the folder again. I opened it slowly, page by page, in the order my attorney had organized them one afternoon in New York City 2 days before. Photographs printed on photo paper, taken by a private investigator I had hired a few months earlier when Marcus's business dealings had begun appearing in industry news for the wrong reasons. Bank statements with transfers highlighted in yellow, legal documents with stamps and signatures, deeds, notarial records, certified declarations. 10 years ago, I said, you took half of everything I had built. The savings, the reserves, the shares I put in your name because I believed what's mine is yours. And I never imagined that phrase would one day need an asterisk. You sold everything the day the judge signed the papers. Didn't wait a week. Not a day. She lowered her eyes. The movement was slow, like someone bowing their head before something that cannot be contested because it is simply true. "I remember," she said. "Good. Because I remember too, every detail. The date, the time, the amount of the transfer. I remember it not out of bitterness, but because some things stay in the memory with a precision that has nothing to do with whether we want them to." I pushed the folder toward her carefully. "Open the last section." She opened it with hands that weren't completely steady. The last pages were different from the earlier ones, less photographs, more legal text. She read slowly, and I watched the exact moment she understood what she was reading, because her face changed in a way that could not be controlled. "That is the deed to this house," I said. "Paid in full. In your name. The mortgage was settled in its entirety last Monday. The bank has been notified. You will not receive any more collection notices on this property." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had the quality of a vacuum, the way sound stops suddenly and the ears take a moment to adjust. She raised her eyes to me, the green ones full of water now, unable to hold it. "Alex, why would you do this?" "Because I am not you." The tears came. She brought her hand to her mouth. She began to say she didn't deserve it, that she was grateful, that I was a far better person than she had ever deserved beside her, that she had been wrong in ways she only now understood, with the full clarity that only comes after it's too late. "There's more," I said before she finished. I stood from the sofa. I walked to the large window overlooking the pool and the garden. Outside, the blue water of the pool was perfectly still, reflecting the afternoon sky with that flawless stillness that looks too perfect to be real. I looked at it for a moment, thinking about how many photos had been taken there, how many carefully framed images of a life assembled with the same attention as a film set. "Do you know why Marcus left?" She didn't answer, just looked at me. "Because his business collapsed. And his business collapsed because the main company he ran, a venture capital fund focused on tech startups, began losing major contracts to a competitor that entered the market with a better platform and a more competitive price." I paused briefly, not for dramatic effect, just because what came next needed a moment of separation to be heard with clarity. "That competitor was my company. Nunes Tech entered the US market 2 years ago, and within 18 months had taken 43% of Marcus's fund's client base. When the contracts left, the cash flow went with them, and when the cash flow went, Marcus went." She stared at me without blinking. Her face had stopped somewhere between incomprehension and something that still had no name. "And 3 weeks ago," I continued, "my office made an acquisition offer to the board of his fund. The fund had debts the partners couldn't cover. The offer was approved unanimously because there was no better alternative available. The company is now mine." I walked back to the living room and stood in the center, facing her. "And last Thursday, I sat personally in the conference room that used to be his, in the same chair where he signed the contracts that he believed made him the kind of man who could walk into someone's life and promise them the world, and I fired him. No intermediary, no HR letter, in person." Her mouth was open. Words tried to form twice and found no way out. "You planned this," she finally said, more to herself than to me. It wasn't an accusation, it was a realization. Not entirely. I entered that market because it was a genuine business opportunity with real merit. What happened to Marcus was a consequence, not an objective. But when the consequence arrived, I paused. I didn't oppose it. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, A breeze passed through the garden and moved the palm trees, the soft movement of the leaves the only sound beyond the breathing of the two of us. "And there's one last thing," I said, "not the most important, but the most true." I went to the window again, my back to her for a moment. Then I turned. "I never remarried. I have no children. I spent 10 years in countries that weren't mine, building a company, accumulating wealth, appearing on the right lists, becoming the kind of man people point to as an example of resilience. And when someone asked me why I hadn't built a family too, I gave answers that sounded reasonable. I said the time hadn't come, that the work required too much commitment, that someday the right moment would arrive." I stopped. I looked at her with the honesty I hadn't planned to have in this conversation, but that was there regardless. "The truth is that after you, I learned, in the most complete and final way possible, that the person you choose to stay can wake up one day and decide they no longer want to stay. And that lesson went deep enough that every time I got close to someone for real, there was a part of me that pulled back before getting too far. You took more than money. You took the ability to trust without calculating the risk." Elena had stopped trying to hold back the tears. They fell now without her doing anything to contain them, slowly, down a face that had lost the curated glow of old photographs, and that was now simply human and ordinary and, in a certain way, more real than I had seen her in years. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was broken. "I'm so sorry, Alex. If there's any way to make any part of this right." I walked to the door. I placed my hand on the handle. I paused with my hand on the cold metal for a second. There isn't. I opened it. The afternoon air came in through the gap, that smell of irrigated garden and hot asphalt that belongs to the upscale neighborhoods of any great American city in the late afternoon. But here is what 10 years taught me about karma, Elena. Karma isn't what we see in movies. There's no dramatic music, no confrontation scene where the hero makes the villain shrink with the perfect line. Karma is quieter than that, more precise. I turned toward the hallway, toward the white marble stretching to the front door, toward the walls with the marks of the paintings that had been taken away. You keep this house paid off, with the garden, the pool, every square foot you chose when you chose the life Marcus was promising. You keep all of it exactly as it is, and every morning you wake up in this house, every time you walk through this entryway, every time you look at that pool outside, you'll remember one thing." I paused. This was supposed to be ours. It was the kind of life I had promised, one that was coming slowly with real foundations, not hidden debt and fragile leverage. You decided that slowly was too slow, that what I was building wasn't enough to wait for. Now it's yours, forever, without me, and without him. Just you in this house, with all the silence a large house can have when there's no one left to fill it. I left. The door closed behind me with that heavy sound of fine hardwood that shuts with precision, no slam, no bang, the kind of sound a mansion door makes, because it was built to last decades regardless of what happens inside. I descended the front steps without hurrying my pace and without looking back. The garden had that golden light specific to late fall afternoons that makes everything look more beautiful than it is for about 40 minutes before it goes fully dark. The palms cast long shadows on the stone path. The driver was standing beside the car with the door already open. I got in, the cool neutral leather of the seat, the clean air-conditioned smell that very fine cars have, the immediate silence that the closed door creates around you like an envelope. My phone vibrated in the inner pocket of my jacket. I pulled it out and looked. It was a message from my assistant in Singapore. 6 words. Transfer complete. The house is in her name. I stared at the message for a moment. Then I placed the phone on the seat beside me, leaned my head back and closed my eyes for a few seconds. There was one thing I had not told her, that I had thought about saying and had decided to keep, not out of cruelty, but because some truths are more honest when left to be discovered alone by the person who needs to find them. In the last 2 years, while I followed from a distance the gradual collapse of Marcus's business and the growing silence of her social media, photos that had become more spaced, then monthly, then none at all, there had been a night in Amsterdam, after a long meeting that had gone well, when I went to dinner alone at a small restaurant near the canal and sat with a glass of wine looking at the dark water outside for a long stretch of time. And I had realized, with a clarity that surprised me by its lack of drama, that the anger had gone, not in any specific event, not with any conscious decision, but gradually, over the years, the way a tide recedes without you being able to mark the exact moment the beach begins to appear. What had taken the anger's place wasn't exactly forgiveness, because forgiveness implies a deliberate act, and what had happened inside me was slower and less intentional than any act. It was closer to acceptance, the quiet recognition that what had happened, that it had altered the course of things in ways that couldn't be undone, and that I had built a real and solid life within that altered course. Elena had taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. She had taught me that what you build alone, with your own hands, without a safety net, without anyone to share the credit or the risk, has a solidity that nothing else has. She had taught me that the trust you place in someone is always a free choice, and that when that choice is poorly returned, the responsibility to rebuild is entirely yours, which is terrible news when it happens, and very good news when you realize what it means. She had taught me without meaning to be the man I was now. I wasn't going to tell her that, not because it wasn't true, but because that part of the story was mine, not hers. The car pulled slowly out of the community, the driver respecting the internal speed limits with that professional care he always had. We passed the security guard, who nodded. We went through the gate and onto the outer boulevard, where the late afternoon traffic was already starting to build in both directions. I looked out the window at the flow of cars and people and the constant movement of a city that doesn't stop, because no one asked it to. I thought of my mother in that small town in Georgia, in a house I had bought for her 3 years ago, that she had accepted after refusing twice, saying it was too expensive. I thought about calling her later, no specific reason, just to hear her voice. I took out my phone again. I opened my email and typed a short message to my attorney, asking him to initiate the process of donating 10% of the shares from Marcus's acquired company to an organization supporting women in financial hardship, one I had been funding for 2 years. Not to compensate for anything, not to balance any moral ledger, just because that was what I had decided to do with that portion of the assets when the acquisition closed, and the acquisition had closed. I sent the email. I leaned my head back against the seat again and looked at the roof of the car. It wasn't revenge. I had said that to her, and it was true. More true than she had probably been able to process in that moment. I hadn't planned Marcus's ruin as an objective. I had built a better company than his because that was what I knew how to do, and because the market opportunity was real. What happened to him was a consequence of having built something more solid than what he had built, which is, when you think about it, exactly what should happen. And Elena kept the house. With the life she had chosen, structured on a foundation that wasn't hers, and had been removed, but now with the mortgage settled, the property real and clear of debt, she would have somewhere to live. She would have security. She would have time to rebuild whatever she chose to rebuild, alone. Sometimes justice is exactly that, not destruction, precision. Making sure each person keeps what they chose, no subterfuge, no escape. Elena had chosen the life with Marcus because she wanted the arrival without the journey, the outcome without the process, the money without the work of building it together. Now she had the arrival, the destination, the house in the gated community with the infinity pool and the manicured garden. Without the person who had promised the journey, without the person who had delivered the destination. Just her and those empty rooms that knew very well what had been in them and what had walked out. That was enough. That, sometimes, is all it needs to be. The car entered the highway, and the driver accelerated with that smoothness of someone trained to make the motion feel natural. New York faded behind the window, the buildings shrinking and then disappearing as the road opened. The sky was turning orange on the horizon, that saturated orange of the American countryside at the end of the afternoon that looks deliberately painted. I was catching the 10 o'clock flight back to Singapore. There was a meeting the following morning with a potential partner in Kuala Lumpur that I didn't want to postpone. Life continued with that constant rhythm that had sustained me for 10 years, and that was now less an escape than simply the way I had learned to exist in the world. But before the flight, I was going to call my mother, just to hear her voice, and tell her I had come back once to the city where it all began, that I had left things where they needed to be, that I was well, truly, without needing to convince either of us this time, that I was well. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. If you stayed here with me, I know something in Alexander's journey touched something inside you. We live in a world that glorifies loud revenge, the perfect confrontation scene, the moment the villain finally gets what they deserve in front of everyone. But the real stories, the ones that stay with you, are the ones that show a man or a woman who could have destroyed and chose to build instead, who could have spent their energy hating and used that same energy to go further than any anger could ever take them. If you've ever started over from zero after someone took something that was yours, if you've ever worked in silence while the world wasn't watching, if you've ever reached a point where you realize that the best karma isn't watching the other person fall, but watching your own life flourish without needing anyone else's collapse, this is for you. You are more than any abandonment. You are the sum of everything you built after someone tried to diminish you. Hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from right now? And do you think Alexander did the right thing by paying off her house? Tell me what you think. See you next time.